The sound of bone snapping can drown out even Christmas bells. I never thought those words would describe my life until the moment my own son broke my finger in the middle of my living room. One quiet winter evening in Kansas, in the same house where I once read bedtime stories to him, betrayal struck like a hammer, painful enough to steal my breath, but also the spark that lit a plan he could never imagine. Before I go on, I want to hear from you. What would you do if your own blood turned against you? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because this story has twists that will leave you stunned. My name is Helen Whitmore, 69 years old, a widow living in a small Kansas town. I spent my life as a nurse watching lives slip away, holding hands as people took their last breaths. Yet nothing prepared me for this, the violence that came from the child I once held in my arms. That evening, Daniel, my son, and his wife Melissa walked into my home carrying glossy photos of chandeliers, velvet booths, and fine dining tables. Their dream was a luxury restaurant, one they insisted could succeed in our quiet town if only I co-signed a $250,000 loan. Melissa leaned across my table, her perfume sharp as poison. "Helen, this isn't just helping us, it's an investment in family. Or do you want to be the one who ruins everything?" Daniel placed his hand over mine, a grip too tight to feel like love. "It's just a signature, Mom. Don't make me do something we'll both regret." I shook my head. My voice trembled, but my words cut like steel. "Your father and I worked our whole lives to live honestly. I will not sign away what we built." And in that instant, I saw it, the flash in my son's eyes. Not hope, not desperation, rage, the kind that devours reason. He lunged, twisting my hand so violently that my index finger cracked with a sound that will haunt me forever. The pain was blinding, searing through my chest. I bit back a scream, tears streaming down my face. But I didn't beg. I didn't break. Melissa only smirked as if she were watching a performance. "This is just the beginning, Helen. Sign or suffer more." I pressed my broken hand against my chest, every heartbeat pounding through the shattered bone. They thought they had silenced me. They thought pain would force surrender. But in that moment of agony, something colder and sharper than fear rose inside me. Daniel stormed out the door, slamming so hard the windows rattled. Melissa's heels clicked across the hardwood as she followed her laughter like glass shattering in the night. Silence settled back over the house, broken only by the hiss of the old furnace and the ragged sound of my breathing. I stared at the photographs scattered across the table, crystal chandeliers, polished wine glasses, the promise of wealth and prestige. A castle in the clouds built on the bones of my sacrifice. And I whispered to the memory of my late husband, Charles. They have no idea who they're dealing with. The snap of that finger was not the end. It was the beginning. The night my finger broke, the pain did not vanish with the dawn. It throbbed with every heartbeat, a reminder not of my fragility, but of the mask I was about to wear. I knew Daniel and Melissa thought they had finally bent me to their will. To them, I was just a broken old woman too frail to fight back. And so, I gave them exactly what they expected. The next morning, I pulled my cane from the closet. Not because I needed it, I hadn't in years, but because weakness can be the sharpest disguise. I hunched my shoulders, let my steps drag across the porch, and greeted the world with trembling hands that could still hold steel beneath the skin. Neighbors nodded politely as they passed. Some whispered, "Poor Helen, she's not what she used to be. What a shame she has no one to really take care of her." I let their pity soak into the air like smoke from a dying fire. But behind that performance, my eyes were sharper than ever. Daniel and Melissa visited often in those weeks, parading into my kitchen with their fake cheer and boxes of cheap muffins. They spoke to me in voices coated with sugar, but sharpened with expectation. "Mom, are you eating enough?" "You look thinner," Daniel would say, pretending concern. "Don't you worry about bills." "Wouldn't it be easier if we helped you manage things?" Melissa added, her smile always just a little too tight. I would nod weakly, sigh dramatically, and mutter lines that made me sound pitiful. "Oh, kids, I don't know how I'd manage without you." Then I'd shuffle to the counter with exaggerated slowness, as if even pouring tea required effort. They thought they were tightening the noose. What they didn't know was that I was weaving the rope myself. Martha, my neighbor across the street, was one of the few who saw through it. She was 72, sharp as a blade, with a laugh that could scare off crows. Every Tuesday we played dominoes on my porch. That day, as I gingerly placed a tile with my swollen finger, Martha narrowed her eyes. "What happened to your hand, Helen?" she asked, her tone as direct as a rifle shot. I hesitated, testing her. Then, with a faint smile, I whispered, "Clumsy me." Slipped in the kitchen. Her gaze lingered on me, too wise to believe the lie. She didn't push. But when Daniel appeared that afternoon demanding I look at loan papers again, Martha happened to be watering her roses. She froze mid-motion as she heard his tone sharp and impatient. "Mom, stop acting confused. It's simple. Just sign the papers," Melissa chimed in, her voice laced with false kindness. "It's for your own good, Helen. Don't you want to live closer to us, in a safer neighborhood?" I saw Martha's head tilt slightly, her lips tightening. She caught the cruelty behind the words, the edge of manipulation. She pretended to focus on her flowers, but I knew she was listening, and I silently thanked God for the witness. Inside, I acted exactly as they wanted me to. I let my voice tremble. I let my eyes water. I let them believe they were winning. But under that frail shell, I was memorizing every word, every insult, every threat. Each moment became a weapon I was storing away. One afternoon, Daniel snapped when I asked too many questions about the restaurant costs. His hand slammed the table, rattling the teacups. Martha's blinds twitched across the street. I didn't need to see her face to know she was recording this moment in her sharp memory. When they finally left, Melissa tossing her empty coffee cup into my sink, without so much as a thank you, Martha crossed the street with her domino box under one arm. She looked at me for a long moment, then simply said, "You're smarter than they think. Don't let them write the ending." Her words struck me like a match to kindling, because she was right. I wasn't letting them destroy me. I was staging a play, and every actor in my life was already on stage without knowing it. Daniel thought he was the director, Melissa the star, but I was the writer, and the script was mine. That night, as I bound my broken finger with quiet determination, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was no frail widow. She was steel-wrapped in linen patience wrapped in trembling hands. And with Martha's silent witness across the street, I knew one thing. Their performance would not end in applause. It would end in revelation. Martha's words lingered in my mind long after she crossed the street that evening. Don't let them write the ending. The next time Daniel and Melissa arrived, they didn't even bother with muffins or polite small talk. They swept in like salespeople rehearsing a pitch, their eyes glittering with greed instead of love. Daniel spread glossy brochures across my coffee table, the bright photographs of chandeliers and velvet booths jarring against the worn wood surface scarred with decades of family meals. "Look at this, Mom," he said, his voice tight with rehearsed excitement. "It's not just a restaurant. It's going to be the most elegant dining experience in Kansas. Fine wines, gourmet steaks, a piano bar. People will drive from hours away." Melissa leaned in, tapping the images with manicured nails, painted a sharp, predatory red. "We'll have celebrity chefs for opening night. It'll be a landmark. And imagine, Helen, you could sit at the best table, be treated like royalty, all thanks to you." Their voices were sugary, but beneath the sweetness I could hear the metallic clink of chains they wanted to lock around me. I looked at the pictures at their two bright smiles, and a memory cut through me like a knife the long nights in the hospital. 40 years of 12-hour shifts as a nurse. Nights where the fluorescent lights burned into my skull. Nights when my back ached from lifting patients twice my size. Nights when I came home to Charles, my late husband, and whispered that it was worth it because we were building something for Daniel's future. I remembered counting coins in a glass jar, slowly saving, cutting every corner. I patched Daniel's jeans when he was a boy, told him someday you'll understand sacrifice. I drove the same car for 20 years so there'd be money for his college. I ate boxed macaroni so he could have fresh fruit. Every wrinkle in my skin, every gray hair, every scar on my hands carried the weight of those choices. And now my life's labor had been reduced to a stack of loan papers. To Daniel, it wasn't a pension earned through decades of sacrifice. It was a blank check waiting to be signed. I let my voice tremble, but this time the bitterness was real. "Daniel, do you think I don't see what this is?" His smile faltered. Melissa's eyes narrowed. "This isn't about some grand restaurant," I whispered the words, tasting of iron in my mouth. "It's about debts, gambling, the poker nights you pretend are business meetings. I've seen the late calls, the whispered arguments. This dream of yours, it's just a disguise, a trap." The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Daniel's jaw clenched. For a moment, I saw the little boy he once was, the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees, who once cried when his goldfish died. But that boy was gone. In his place stood a man whose eyes flashed with desperation and fury. "Mom, he," said, his voice low, "you don't understand. This is an opportunity, a way out. If you just—" Melissa cut him off, her tone sharper, colder. "She understands perfectly. She just doesn't care. Helen, if you don't sign, you're not only destroying Daniel's chance, you're destroying our future. You'll be the reason we lose everything." I almost laughed. Lose everything. They had already stripped me of trust, of peace, of dignity. What more was left to take? I folded my trembling hands in my lap, the bandaged finger throbbing, as if reminding me of the truth. For years I had been the silent provider, the dependable widow, the easy mark. But as I watched their faces, my son's mask of ambition cracking, Melissa's smile sharpening into threat, I knew the act had to continue. "Yes," I murmured, letting my voice quaver. "Maybe I am too old to see clearly. Maybe you're right." Their shoulders relaxed instantly. Relief washed over their faces like gamblers who believed they'd just won the final hand. But inside, bitterness coiled tighter in my chest. They thought they had me trapped in their game. What they didn't know was that I had learned the rules of survival long before they were even born. Because in the hospital, I'd seen the way people die suddenly, brutally, or slowly, with dignity. And I had chosen always to fight for dignity. Even now. Especially now. As they packed up their glossy brochures and congratulated each other in whispers, I stared at the shadows stretching across my living room wall. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of betrayal more crushing than any long night in the ER. My sacrifices had been twisted into debts, my love translated into collateral, my entire existence condensed into a signature line at the bottom of a contract. But if they thought I was a weak old woman, they were about to learn what decades of endurance, grief, and silent strength could really create. The trap wasn't mine. It was theirs, and I had already begun to close it. That night, after the brochures were gone and the house returned to silence, I sat in my rocking chair with the lights dimmed low. The shadows danced across the walls like old companions. My broken finger throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat, but it was no longer the pain that kept me awake. It was the memory of their faces, the way they had smiled as though I were already conquered, already erased. I thought I was alone in my misery until the sound of voices drifted through the thin December air. Daniel and Melissa were standing just outside on the porch, their whispers sharp enough to cut through the cold night. I leaned closer to the cracked window frame, breath shallow the way I used to lean over a patient whose life hung by a thread. "You push her too hard, she'll bolt," Daniel muttered, his tone thick with frustration. Melissa's reply came swift venom in every syllable. "She won't. She's pathetic. Look at her hobbling around with that cane trembling like a leaf. She'll sign. She has no choice." I gripped the armrest so tightly my knuckles blanched. But it wasn't until Melissa's next words that my stomach dropped into ice. "And when she's gone, when the old woman finally dies, we'll have it all. No neighbors sniffing around, no charities getting a dime. Everything will be ours, every last cent." The cruelty was so casual, so matter-of-fact, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Not just greed, not just manipulation. They weren't waiting to inherit, they were planning my disappearance, my erasure. They wanted not only my money, but the obliteration of my dignity, the theft of my very legacy. I closed my eyes and saw flashes of my life. Charles and I building our home nail by nail, Daniel, as a boy running through the yard with a stick, pretending it was a sword, the long nights in the hospital where I comforted strangers more tenderly than my own child now comforted me. All of it, all of me reduced in their minds to a balance sheet. I swallowed hard, forcing my tears to stay inside. I had spent too many years letting the world see me as fragile. Tonight my grief was private, and it hardened into something else, resolve. Melissa's laugh rang out in the darkness light and sharp as breaking glass. Once her name is off, everything she can rot in that little house for all I care. We'll say we tried to help. People will believe us. Who listens to a senile old woman anyway? Her words ignited a fire in my chest. Senile, worthless, pathetic. Every insult they had ever thrown now formed a weapon I would turn against them. When the doors slammed and their car drove away, I sat in the dark for a long time. The only sound, the steady tick of the clock above the mantel. Each tick was a reminder time was not theirs to steal. It was mine. I thought of the patience I'd lost over the years, of how many had whispered final words into the dark, fearing they would be forgotten. Don't let me disappear. That was the plea in every trembling hand I held, every fading breath I witnessed. And now I understood I was fighting not just for my money, not just for my house. I was fighting for my name, my history, my very right to exist as more than a ledger line. That night I made a vow. I whispered it into the silence as though Charles might still be listening. They want me erased, but I will write my own ending. I rose from the chair slowly, every movement deliberate, and went to the drawer where I kept my old leather notebook. In it were names, dates, scraps of information I had quietly collected over the years, every time Daniel or Melissa slipped, every time they revealed the hunger behind their smiles. I opened to the first page, touched the ink with my unbroken hand, and felt a calm steel settle over me. They thought they had me trapped, but they had already given me everything I needed: proof of their ambition, evidence of their contempt. They had spoken the words themselves, confessed their greed into the night air, not knowing it reached my ears, and from that moment the game changed. I was no longer the widow with trembling hands, no longer the mother who endured in silence. I was something else, something they had never expected. I was the hunter, and Daniel and Melissa, for all their schemes and whispered threats, were already caught in a web they couldn't see. The night of the whispers, I barely slept. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my broken finger throbbing with every beat of my heart, each throb a reminder of the truth I had overheard. They didn't just want my money. They wanted my erasure. By sunrise, I knew silence would no longer be enough. I needed help, but not from family, not from neighbors who whispered pity over fences. I needed someone who could see through masks, someone who had lived long enough to understand betrayal. That afternoon, I dialed a number I hadn't called in years, Frank Harris. He had been Charles's closest friend, a man who once wore a police badge with pride. After Charles's funeral, Frank had visited a few times, bringing casseroles and awkward words of comfort, but life had pulled us apart. Still, I remembered his steady gaze, the way he could cut through lies with a single glance. When I told him I needed to talk, his voice on the phone was gravelly but warm. "Helen, come by. I'll put on coffee. Black the way you like it." Frank lived in a modest brick house at the edge of town, the kind of place where the flag still waved on the porch and old case files gathered dust in the den. When he opened the door, age had etched deeper lines into his face, but his eyes, blue sharp and unflinching, hadn't changed. I sat at his kitchen table, the same table where Charles and Frank had played poker on Friday nights decades ago. I told him everything: Daniel's demands, Melissa's manipulations, the broken finger, the whispers in the dark about transferring my assets. My voice cracked, but my eyes held steady. When I finished, Frank leaned back silent for a long moment. Finally, he muttered, "Jesus, Helen. I knew that boy was troubled, but this..." He shook his head slowly. "This isn't family trouble anymore. This is elder abuse, plain and simple." The words struck me like a gavel. elder abuse. It was one thing to think of myself as betrayed, another to hear it defined like a crime. Frank rose and disappeared into his study. When he returned, he held a small card between two fingers. "You need someone sharper than me. Laura Jenkins. She's a bulldog in a courtroom and has made it her mission to protect seniors from vultures, sometimes their own blood." The next day, I met Laura at her downtown office. She was nothing like I expected. Younger than I imagined at 45, with hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her presence commanding. She listened without interrupting as I laid out my story, her pen gliding across a yellow legal pad. Only when I finished did she lean forward, her voice calm but edged with fire. "Helen, I need you to understand something. What they're doing isn't just cruel, it's illegal. But the law requires proof. You say they whisper, plans, threaten, manipulate. That's powerful, but only if we catch it." I nodded, my chest tightening. "How do I do that? I'm just one old woman." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Old maybe. But powerless, not even close. The key is to let them think they're winning. Play the frail widow. Let them underestimate you. And while they're busy plotting, you'll be recording, documenting, building the case brick by brick. When the time comes, we'll pull the curtain back, and they won't know what hit them." The strategy chilled me with its cold precision, but it also lit something fierce inside me. For years, I had perfected the art of seeming weak. Now that weakness could become my sharpest weapon. Laura handed me a small black device no bigger than a locket. "Keep this close. It records everything. Hide it in plain sight. And write everything down, dates, words, even looks. Memory fades, but paper doesn't." As I slipped the device into my pocket, I felt its weight like armor. Leaving her office, I walked through the bustling streets with a strange new clarity. The people rushing by had no idea what storm I carried inside. To them, I was just another gray-haired woman clutching her purse too tightly, but inside, I was steel. That evening, Daniel called again. His voice was syrupy, too smooth. "Mom, we've been thinking, maybe it's time you let us help you manage your accounts, just to keep things simple." I smiled into the phone, though he couldn't see it. "Oh, Daniel," I said softly, letting my voice tremble just so. "You're right, I don't know how I'd manage without you." He exhaled in relief, mistaking surrender for truth. What he didn't know was that every word was being captured by the locket against my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than fear. I felt control, because now I wasn't just surviving, I was hunting, and the game had only just begun. The locket in my pocket wasn't enough. Laura's words echoed in my mind, "Proof, Helen. That's how you win, not pity, not suspicion, proofs." So I began to build my fortress not of stone, but of secrets. The first step was the clock. It hung in my living room for decades, a round wooden relic Charles had bought at a garage sale. To anyone else, it was just an old timepiece ticking away the hours. But tucked inside its hollow frame was a camera, no bigger than a coin. Frank had shown me how to set it up, his hands steady, despite the arthritis that had bent his knuckles. "Angle it toward the sofa," he said gruffly, adjusting the lens with surprising delicacy. "That's where they'll sit when they try to corner you. Let them perform for the camera." I knotted my chest tight with both fear and exhilaration. My own living room had become a stage, and I was no longer just the victim, I was the director. The second step was the phone. Every call from Daniel, every shrill word from Melissa I recorded. At first my voice shook when I spoke, the old habit of submission pressing down on me like a weight. But as days passed, I found a rhythm, feigned confusion, weak sighs, calculated pauses that drew out their cruelty. Melissa's words hissed through the line one morning, her patience snapping like brittle glass. "For God's sake, Helen, stop dragging this out. Just sign the papers. You think you're special? You're nothing but an old woman with money you don't even know how to use." Her contempt cut deep, but I kept my tone small, shaky. "Oh dear, I just get so mixed up these days. Maybe Daniel can explain it again when he comes by." Her laugh was sharp, triumphant, and I let her have it. Because every syllable now lived inside the recorder, captured forever. The third step was Frank himself. He visited often, sometimes carrying a bag of groceries, sometimes just a newspaper tucked under his arm. To the neighbors, it looked like an old friend checking in on a lonely widow. But inside these walls, Frank was my silent sentinel. When Daniel's temper flared, Frank happened to be sipping coffee at my table. His steady presence turned every threat into evidence, every insult into testimony. I could see the flicker of unease in Daniel's eyes when he realized his outbursts weren't private anymore. Melissa, however, covered her nerves with sharp smiles, each one tighter than the last. One afternoon, Daniel paced my living room like a caged animal. "Mom, you don't understand what's at stake. The people I owe." He stopped himself too late. His eyes darted toward Frank, who was stirring sugar into his coffee as if he hadn't heard. But he had, and so had the tiny camera ticking silently from inside the clock. I said nothing, only folded my hands in my lap, letting Daniel drown in his own words. The old Helen, the silent, submissive Helen, was exactly the role I needed to play. And every day the role became easier, because underneath my resolve was no longer trembling. It was iron. At night, I would sit alone replaying the recordings, watching the footage. Each insult, each threat, each slip of truth stacked like bricks in a wall that was rising higher around me. A fortress of evidence, a monument to the years of sacrifice they had spat on. But there were moments quiet, aching moments when the weight of it all pressed against me. In the glow of the lamplight, I would trace the cracks in my hands, the hands that once held Daniel as a child. I'd remember the way his small fingers clutched mine when he was scared of thunderstorms. And now those same hands had bent mine until it broke. The grief was sharp, but I let it burn, because grief, I realized, could be turned into fuel. Frank noticed the change in me. One evening, as we played dominoes on the porch, he set his tile down with a smirk. "You've got that look, Helen, the one Charles used to get before he caught a liar red-handed. You're planning something." I met his gaze, a faint smile tugging at my lips. Not planning Frank, preparing. For weeks, the act continued. Daniel grew more frantic, Melissa more venomous. They circled me like vultures, convinced the carcass was already theirs. But all the while, they were digging their own graves, word by word, threat by threat, recorded and stored where they could never erase it. And I knew, with a certainty, that steadied even my shaking hands when the time came, their performance would not end in applause. It would end in exposure. The days bled into December, each one colder than the last, each one bringing me closer to the performance Daniel and Melissa thought they were staging. I had played my role so well that even I sometimes believed the stoop of my shoulders, the tremor in my voice. But inside, I was sharper than ever, every moment of cruelty now preserved in the vault of my evidence. Then came Christmas Eve. Daniel insisted on hosting a party that night. "It'll be good for you, Mom," he told me, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Family, neighbors, a real celebration. But I knew what it really was, a spectacle. A stage for them to parade their supposed triumph, to show the town that my house, my home, was already theirs in spirit, if not yet in law. When I arrived, cane in hand, I paused at the doorway. The place I had built with Charles's laughter and my long years of work no longer looked like mine. Daniel had strung lights across the porch with careless excess, and inside Melissa had decorated with the gaudy hand of someone trying too hard tinsel, dripping like false promises. Crystal glasses lined up on the counter as though abundance could disguise rot. Neighbors filled the living room, sipping wine, nibbling at hors d'oeuvres. They murmured polite compliments, eyes flitting between Daniel's forced charm and Melissa's bright, brittle laugh. My name was spoken often, but always as though I were fading into myth. Helen's such a trooper. Helen's lucky to have children to take care of her. I sat quietly in a chair by the fireplace, my broken finger hidden beneath a lace glove. The fire crackled, and I let its warmth anchor me as I watched them. Daniel stood tall in the center, gesturing broadly as he boasted, "We've got big plans for this place. Melissa and I were going to give it the upgrade it deserves, a new start. Something special for the whole community." My stomach clenched at his words. This wasn't a new start. It was the slow erasure of everything Charles and I had built, the rewriting of history with them as the heroes. And the neighbors, dazzled by free drinks and the glow of twinkle lights, nodded along, none daring to question. The evening wore on, wine flowing freely, laughter brittle and too loud. And then it happened. Melissa, glass in hand, swayed unsteadily as she clinked it against another. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes glassy. She leaned close to a small group gathered near the tree and spoke with the smugness of someone who believed the battle already won. "Oh, please," she said, her words slurring just enough to loosen their grip. "The old woman's nothing more than a housekeeper who refuses to move out. That's all she is. And soon enough this will all be ours, every last piece of it." Her laughter rang out high and sharp, slicing through the murmur of conversation. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their glances flicking toward me, where I sat in silence by the fire. I felt the heat of humiliation scorch my cheeks, the sting of betrayal cutting deeper than the cold outside. To be reduced in front of my own community to nothing more than a stubborn servant in the house I had sacrificed for it was a cruelty that almost stole my breath. Almost. I did not rise. I did not shout. I sat perfectly still, my lace-gloved hand tightening on the head of my cane until my knuckles whitened, my lips pressed together, holding in the tide of grief and fury that surged inside me. Because I understood something then. Their arrogance was my weapon, their mockery my proof. And in that moment of humiliation, I realized I no longer needed to pretend. The neighbors had heard. The mask had slipped. Melissa's laughter was the sound of her undoing. I looked into the flames, letting their reflection dance in my eyes. And though I sat silent, though I seemed small in my chair inside me, a fire blazed brighter than any string of Christmas lights. I could feel it in my bones. Stronger than pain, stronger than fear, the time for silence was ending. And when it did, it would not be with a whimper. It would be with a reckoning. Christmas came and went, leaving behind nothing but the sour aftertaste of Melissa's drunken insult and the hollow echo of forced laughter in my living room. But I did not crumble. I waited. Patient, quiet, like a hunter who knows the prey will walk right into the trap if she just stays still. The invitation, no, the command, came on a bitterly cold January morning. Daniel called his tone clipped businesslike, as though I were no longer his mother, but a reluctant client. "Mom," he said, "we've set the meeting. The bank needs your signature to finalize the loan. Melissa and I will pick you up at 10. Wear something decent." I stared at the phone long after the call ended. My finger, the one he had broken weeks earlier, still ached in the cold. It was a reminder of pain, yes, but also of the line I had crossed within myself. There would be no going back. At precisely 10 o'clock, their car pulled into my driveway. Daniel, in his pressed shirt, Melissa in a sharp blazer, far too expensive for a woman drowning in debt. They looked like actors about to take a bow for a performance they believed flawless. Ready, Mom. Daniel asked, his smile a blade hidden in velvet. I nodded, cane in hand, my eyes lowered, playing the part one final time. The frail widow, the gullible old woman, the signature waiting to be stolen. The bank's glass doors opened with a mechanical hiss, the sterile scent of polish and paper filling my lungs. I walked between them like a condemned soul escorted to her execution. But I was not condemned. Not today. Inside, their attorney's slick hair-polished shoes was already waiting. He spread the documents across the polished table with the pride of a man unveiling a masterpiece. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, feigning courtesy, "these are the agreements. A few signatures and your children's dream becomes reality." Melissa leaned forward, her nails tapping impatiently on the table. "It's all standard," she chimed. "We've explained everything. Nothing complicated." I let my hand tremble as I reached for the pen. But before I could touch the paper, the banker cleared his throat. Robert Gaines, mid-50s, steady eyes, the kind of man who had seen greed wear many masks. He glanced at me, then at the attorney. "Before we proceed," he said, "we'll need to verify Mrs. Whitmore's financial standing. Bank policy." Daniel waved a dismissive hand. "That's unnecessary. She's retired. Modest pension, Social Security, we've already discussed." But Robert's gaze hardened. "It is necessary, sir. A co-signer must demonstrate capacity. Otherwise, this loan cannot move forward." The room shifted. The air thickened. Melissa's smile faltered. Daniel's jaw clenched, and I lowered my eyes, hiding the spark that had ignited within me. Robert typed into his computer, fingers moving deliberately. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft click of keys. Then the screen lit up, casting a glow that seemed to drain the blood from Daniel's face. Robert turned the monitor slightly, his voice steady, almost too calm. "Mrs. Whitmore, our system shows you maintain accounts across 3 institutions. Combined savings and investments total approximately $3.2 million. The words detonated in the room like a grenade. Melissa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The attorney blinked suddenly, unsure of his script. And Daniel? My son stared at the numbers as though they were ghosts come to haunt him. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. 3.2 million. I lifted my chin for the first time, letting my eyes meet his. He saw it then, the truth. The betrayal reversed the mask of frailty, falling away piece by piece. "You always told us you had nothing," Daniel whispered, his voice raw. "You said you were barely making it." I let the silence linger, then spoke each word, heavy as stone. "I let you believe what you wanted to believe. Because greed, Daniel, reveals itself most clearly when it thinks no one is watching." Melissa shook her head in disbelief. You lied to us." "No," I said, my voice sharper now, rising like steel through years of sorrow. "I protected myself. You lied when you promised care but plotted theft. You lied when you smiled while counting what you thought were the final days of my independence. And now," I gestured toward the glowing screen, "now the truth stands in front of you, undeniable." The attorney cleared his throat, attempting to salvage the moment, regardless of her assets, the loan. But Robert cut him off. "I cannot in good conscience proceed with documents presented under coercion. Mrs. Whitmore, you are under no obligation to sign anything today." I leaned back, the lace glove tight around my aching hand, my heart steady. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I felt the full weight of power return to me. Daniel slumped in his chair, pale and trembling. Melissa's eyes darted wildly, searching for an exit from a trap she hadn't even known was closing. I did not gloat, not yet. But inside, a quiet satisfaction burned like a candle against the dark. They had thought me weak. They had thought me broken. But the reckoning had only just begun. The silence in that sterile bank office was almost holy. Numbers had spoken, and the son who thought I was destitute now knew I had built an empire he could never touch. But that was only the first crack in the facade. Truth, real truth, has a way of demanding light. Robert the banker closed his folder, clearly shaken but resolute. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said firmly, "you are under no obligation to sign. In fact, I recommend you take legal counsel before proceeding further." Melissa shot to her feet. "This is ridiculous," she barked, her voice trembling with both fear and rage. "We brought her here to help us, and now you're interfering with family business. You don't understand." But I raised my hand, and the gesture silenced even her shrill protests. My cane clattered softly against the floor as I stood. For months, I had stooped, shuffled, whispered. Now my back was straight, my voice clear. "You're right, Melissa," I said evenly. "This is family business, and it is time everyone knows the truth." From my purse, I withdrew a small USB stick, unremarkable to the eye, but inside it contained hours of poison distilled into undeniable proof. I handed it to Robert. "Plug it in," I told him. He hesitated only briefly before inserting it into his computer, and then the office filled with voices, Melissa's shrieks, Daniel's threats, their greedy laughter captured in the dead of night. "When she dies, at least we won't have to share a dime. Push her harder. She's weak. She'll fold." The walls themselves seemed to shiver with the ugliness of their words. Melissa's face drained of color. Daniel's eyes darted to the door like a cornered animal. But I wasn't finished. From my coat pocket, I withdrew a thin folder. Inside were affidavits signed by Frank Harris and Martha Klein, two people who had quietly witnessed too much for too long. Frank with his steady ex-cop's handwriting recounting Daniel's threats when he thought no one could hear. Martha describing Melissa's drunken boasts at the Christmas party. Robert read aloud, his voice carrying across the room like a judge delivering sentence. The attorney who had come to shepherd their scam shifted uneasily in his chair. Even he could see the ship sinking beneath them. Melissa lunged toward me, her manicured fingers curled like claws. "You witch! You set us up!" I did not flinch. Frank stepped forward from the hallway where he had been waiting, broad-shouldered, even in retirement. "That's enough," he said, his voice like gravel. And then came the final chord in the symphony I had composed. The door opened and Laura Jenkins entered, her heels clicking on the tile, her presence commanding attention. She wasn't alone. At her side stood Sheriff Dalton, the law embodied in his broad frame and silver badge. The room froze. Laura's voice was cool, precise, the voice of a woman who had fought 100 battles and never walked away beaten. Daniel Whitmore, Melissa Whitmore. By the authority vested in this office, you are under investigation for elder abuse coercion and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The sheriff's voice followed deep and final. We have a warrant for your arrest. Gasps rippled through the bank. Clerks stopped in their tracks, clients craned their necks from their chairs. The whole town, it seemed, had been holding its breath for this moment. Daniel's bravado shattered. You can't do this. She's my mother. I turned toward him, my gaze steady. Yes, Daniel, I am your mother. And that should have meant protection, respect, love. Instead, you raised your hand against me. You tried to erase me for money. That bond was broken long before today. Melissa screamed as the sheriff's deputies moved in, her words tumbling in chaos. She's lying. She twisted everything. We were just trying to help. But the recording still echoed from the computer, shredding her denial into dust. Handcuffs clicked shut, sharp metallic, undeniable. The sound of justice finding its rhythm. As they were led away, the crowd of onlookers parted. Some whispered. Some stared at me with new eyes. I, the woman they thought fragile, poor, invisible, had revealed herself as something else entirely. I stood taller than I had in years, though my hand still ached where my son had broken it. Pain remained, but so did power. Laura turned to me, her expression softened now. Helen, you've done more than protect yourself. You've set a precedent. Others will learn from this. The sheriff tipped his hat, a gesture of respect rarely offered. Ma'am, he said gravely, you remind us all that age is not weakness. It's strength forged in fire. As Daniel and Melissa disappeared through the bank's glass doors, their dreams of easy fortune collapsing in chains, I felt the eyes of the town upon me. Not pitying eyes this time, not whispers of poor old widow. No, they saw me as I truly was, and for the first time in a long, long while, so did I. 6 months slipped by, but they did not disappear into shadows the way the years before had. No, these months breathed differently. They carried the scent of salt and sea, of morning breezes that rustled palm fronds instead of the suffocating stillness of my old Kansas living room. The day I signed the papers to sell that house, I did not weep. I expected I might. After all, it had been my fortress, my prison, my battlefield. But instead, I felt a weight lift from my chest. The cracked wallpaper, the worn-out sofa, the blood-stained memory of a broken finger, all of it belonged to a chapter I had finished writing. Martha stood beside me that day, her hand warm and firm. Helen, she whispered, this is your clean slate. And she was right. Together we packed what mattered, a handful of photographs, my husband's old watch, Martha's domino set, and left the rest behind. By summer, we were standing barefoot on the balcony of a modest but sunlit apartment in Clearwater, Florida, the ocean spreading wide before us like a second chance painted in blue and gold. The sea was loud, alive, merciless, yet eternal. In it, I saw myself. I did not retreat into silence as I had after widowhood. This time, I stepped forward. With Laura's guidance, I used a portion of my savings to establish the Whitmore Foundation, a fund for women over 60 who had suffered the same invisible chains I had once borne. Women manipulated by their children. Women silenced by shame. Women who had been told they were burdens instead of blessings. Our first meeting nearly broke me open. 20 women gathered in a small hall, some trembling with fear, some with bitterness burning their eyes, all of them carrying scars that could not be seen. When I stood at the podium, my voice quivered, but not with weakness. "I am Helen Whitmore," I began, and they thought they could erase me. Instead, I wrote myself back into existence. Applause thundered, not polite, but raw, desperate healing. In that moment, I knew my pain had been transfigured into power. Back in Kansas, justice had not been delayed. Daniel and Melissa stood trial, and for once my son could not talk or charm his way out of accountability. The recordings, the witnesses, the bruises on my hand, they told the story I had lived in silence. They were sentenced fraud, coercion, elder abuse. Not a life behind bars, but long enough for the world to etch its lessons into their bones. The court mandated therapy as part of their parole, forcing them to confront the ugliness they had both denied. Sometimes late at night, I wondered if Daniel cursed my name. Other nights I allowed myself to hope that therapy peeled away the greed and left some trace of the boy who once hugged me at the kitchen table after his first baseball game. But I no longer lived waiting for redemption from him. That was no longer my burden. What surprised me most was the children. My grandchildren, untainted by their parents' choices, came back to me as if a spell had been broken. At first, shy visits carrying seashells and awkward hugs, but soon they returned freely, laughing on the beach, helping me set up folding chairs for foundation events, asking questions about their grandfather they never had the chance to know. Their love was different this time, pure, untethered from schemes or debts, and my heart, so battered, began to heal in their laughter. Evenings became my cathedral. Martha and I would sit on the balcony, wine glasses in hand, dominoes abandoned mid-game, the ocean devouring the sun in its endless hunger. She would tease me, "Helen, you were made for battle. Now you have to learn peace." I smiled because she was right. Peace felt strange, but it was mine. One evening, as twilight draped itself across the waves, I sat alone watching the horizon dissolve into fire. The memories flickered, Daniel's rage, Melissa's sneer, the metallic echo of handcuffs. But they no longer suffocated me. They were simply fragments of the road I had walked, scars that no longer bled. I whispered into the ocean's roar, not to anyone else but to myself, life doesn't end at 65. It begins the moment you dare to stand. And in that moment, with salt air filling my lungs and the world wide open before me, I knew Helen Whitmore was no longer the woman who suffered in silence. I was reborn.